Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. We flew up the coast, up the shoreline at a fairly low altitude, and headed for Lorenzo Marques. It wasn't a long flight, but exciting to see the turquoise blue sea, the same Indian Ocean I'd swum in ever since I could remember. But here it looked completely different. The sea was almost transparent due to the fact that the sand beneath it was pure white and reflected the sunlight back. Also, the shore was almost dead straight, as there seemed to be no cliffs or boulders as there were on the Natal and Zululand coasts. The waves and currents must have been a lot tamer than our own wild shores, with their turbulent currents and enormous waves crashing like thunder onto the beaches, or which hurled themselves at rocky promontories, churning up our slightly more beige sand into a maelstrom. This was a far more tranquil and pure sea, and I stared at it, captivated by its clarity. We could see the shadow of our plane darkening the sea bottom as we flew along. We landed at Lorenzo Marques Airport with a bump and a thump and climbed off to wait for our luggage. This arrived being laboriously dragged on what looked like old wooden pallets on casters, hauled by a couple of sweating local Eastern Portuguese. I stared at them. They looked so different from our Zulus. They were pitch black, almost coal black, which looked even more black through the sheen of sweat. It was hotter here than Durban had been and had a higher humidity, making us all feel sticky, especially as our aircraft had remained like an oven throughout our flight. No air conditioning for us. These perspiring men hauled our bags and other paraphernalia off and dumped them at our feet. In polite Zulu, I asked them where we should go to check on our connecting flight to Vilanculos, which was tomorrow, and then to find a taxi. They looked at me blankly, and I repeated my request. Still, they stared back at me, the whites of their eyes, which is all I could really detect in the gloom of the old airport building, revealing nothing. They looked at each other puzzled and then back at me. Fred stepped in with his English as spoken to foreigners, which was slowly using small words and rather louder, as if that would help. Still nothing. Then the two men exchanged something in Portuguese and pointed over to a desk. There we confirmed that yes, Our plane for Vilanculos was leaving at 10 the next morning, and we could hail a taxi from the front of the small, shabby and peeling old airport building. Our taxi, driven by a mad-looking white man who looked like a crazier version of Che Guevara, took off like a bullet and hurtled down an extremely potholed, tarred road, dodging the deeper holes with a violent swerve and diving right into the smaller ones, which jolted the already wrecked suspension of the rusted old car. Fred and I hung on for dear life, our knuckles white as we clutched the fraying armrests. No seat belts in those days, and the vehicle couldn't have been much younger than I was. Alongside us, blurring by, we saw our first ever squatter settlements. This was the real Africa, not the sanitized South African apartheid one. At home, Africans lived well out of sight in apparently orderly rows of tiny square houses in the cities, or in kraals, which were clusters of round thatched huts in the country. I'd seen some African townships from the air when we'd flown from Joburg. There were millions of regimented rows of what looked like minute, identical houses packed together in a huge area all around the very outer perimeters of that enormous city. I'd never been to a township. No white people did. There was no reason to go there. It could be dangerous, we'd all been told, and the Africans would come to us to work in buses provided by the state, and that was that. Here it was a completely different scene. They lived packed together, sharing corrugated iron sheets as walls, using billboards like the one for Coca-Cola, some with parts of the red and white logo still visible as roofs, and even cardboard was being used as building material. There wasn't a straw of thatch or a single mud wall to be seen anywhere. Wandering around this chaos were goats, cattle, which could only be described as ambulatory boneyards, they were so thin, scrawny chickens pecking desperately at any rubbish they could find, and people. These were as black as the two Eastern Portuguese Africans we'd come across before, but so thin. They were tall and bony, and every single one was skinny to the point of emaciation. I was shocked. In my entire life, I'd never seen squalor like this before. I was African, there was no doubt about that. My own ancestors in South Africa went way back to 1652, and my feet and roots are deeply embedded in African soil. But still, I was utterly and completely speechless with horror at the endless scenes that whipped by as we sped towards the city about 10 miles away. That 10 miles consisted of solid squatter camps, as far back as one could see, and without a glimpse of daylight between the shacks along the road. There was filth, poverty, and garbage. None of the latter was edible. The unfortunate beasts and fowls had seen to that, and it seemed that even plastic bags, sheeting, and cardboard that wasn't discarded, just used as building material. The stench was indescribable. Well, describable. It was pure human waste. There were no pit latrines here, none that I could see anyway. There weren't even ditches or canals dug in the sand where people could relieve themselves and then at least cover up the results No, there was sewage everywhere, lying in puddles where the sand had compacted into mud and filth, or running in trickles to God knows where. And there were children playing everywhere too. They played chicken in the road with the cars like ours that shot by, driven dementedly by white Portuguese colonials, or slower, even more broken down vehicles driven by blacks. These skinny kids darted about between the cars and trucks, hands outstretched, begging by screaming something to us in Portuguese. Again, I was shocked, horrified by the sight of such visible poverty. There were no beggars in South Africa, neither black nor white. I'd only ever seen a tramp begging once, when I was just starting my one and only term at the government school in Nottingham Road to learn Afrikaans. Mum had parked next to the butchery after picking us up, as she usually did, and shot in to pick up her meat order, when there was a tapping at the passenger window where I was sitting, reading. I looked up from my book to see a grizzled and filthy old white man with a long grey beard peering in. His clothes were all raggedy, and he stank of something strange. He was about to open his mouth and speak when Mum came galloping down the front steps from the butcher's, a parcel in her hands. She shouted rudely at him, and he withdrew and shambled off. I'd been shocked by then. Mum didn't shout at old white people, only black ones. I'd begun to ask her what that was all about when she cut me off briskly as she turned the key in the ignition to start the car. That was just a tramp, and we roared off. I was just about to ask about tramps when I caught her eye. She glared ahead at the road, and I knew to keep quiet. Many years later, when I moved in with Fred to his bachelor flat at the top of King's House, I noticed that in the winter there seemed to be a lot of men, very similar to the one I'd encountered before in Nottingham Road, sleeping under the bushes. As far back as Victorian times, when the Victoria Embankment had been built, the Durban municipality had planted lawns and shrubberies of indigenous and exotic plants. There were lush lawns and dense bushes everywhere, with park benches installed at regular intervals. But I'd seen bundles sleeping on those benches. Admittedly, they'd been white people. I asked someone at my chartered accountant's office, who explained about the tramp migration that took place every year. Apparently, when winter approached, the Joburg tramps hopped onto goods trains and came down to Durban in droves, taking advantage of our tropical winters, when there was thick white frost on the ground up in the Highveld. Our winters were so mild that the temperatures at night barely dipped below 18 degrees centigrade, and if it did, it made newspaper headlines. Perfect for someone to sleep comfortably outside on a soft, dry lawn. Thanks to the nightly curfew, forcing out all Africans who didn't have a legitimate pass unless they had night jobs in the city, there was no chance of the tramps being mugged for their shoes or other meagre possessions. So every May, Durban became the tramp mecca. They began to trickle in, settling into public parks and gardens. As long as they behaved themselves, didn't beg or get into too many noisy fights, or actually pass out in the flower beds, the South African police seemed to leave them alone. One Sunday morning, I watched with fascination as a tramp had his breakfast. He had half a loaf of brown bread, a quarter bottle of blue methylated spirits, and a battered, chipped enamel mug. He carefully poured all the meths into the cut side of the bread, holding it over his mug, which he gripped between his knees. Then he squeezed the bread until most of the meths trickled into his mug. He drank the contents of the mug in one huge gulp, and then proceeded to eat the soggy bread, tearing off chunks and stuffing them into his toothless mouth. According to the same person at the office, the bread was meant to filter out the blue color put there by the manufacturers to warn people that it was dangerous to drink it. But he ate the bread as well, I told the guy. He just shrugged. Some of them are so inured to the toxins and meths that they don't even notice it, he explained. Some tramps, amazingly, live to a ripe old age on that sort of diet. Now, in Mozambique, I saw filth and poverty everywhere I looked. I asked our driver why the city allowed these squatters. Actually, I didn't know what to call them, so I called them slums, to develop to such an extent that there were so many miles of them next to the airport road alone. He simply shrugged and in his broken English said something derogatory about the Africans. He didn't seem to care, and eventually we began to see proper suburbs approaching, with real buildings, whitewashed walls, and little gardens. I felt overwhelmed by the sight of so much human deprivation. Where did one even begin to start worrying about the state of these unfortunate and hopeless-looking people? We pulled up with a screech of balding tires at the front portico of the hotel that Diana had recommended we spend the night in. Our plane to Vilanculos had only one flight a day, and the service from Joburg never coincided with it, so we were forced to stay a night in LM, whether we wanted to or not. Fred and I had already had our fill of fancy hotels, but both my sisters had warned us not to stay anywhere other than the best one there, as the standard all the other cheaper hotels was extremely rough. Real flea pits, Diana called them. It seemed to be all or nothing in Mozambique, and we didn't have much choice. I'm going to leave it there. We're getting to the best part of Paradise Island, which maybe some of you might know, but it's pretty spectacular. I hope you're enjoying our honeymoon. If you want to move on to other stuff, let me know. I do enjoy my feedback. And by the way, hello, Clive. Thanks for your comments. Hello, Tony from New Zealand. Hi, Scott. And finally, thank you so much to John Moslane for being my sound engineer and allowing me to do this. So it's goodbye from me until next week. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works. I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.